Alright, Dragon Age 2 is the follow-up to Dragon Age Origins that was released in 2011 after an 18-month development cycle. It had a mixed reception to say the least, with fans of the first game and critics alike attacking its story and gameplay design choices. But this game seems to have had a bit of a renaissance among some fans, myself included, so I'm going to talk about both my initial reaction and how I've come to appreciate the game since. Jumping into the combat system first, Dragon Age 2 tried to up the tempo of Origins combat by increasing attack rates and movement speed. In terms of this goal, Dragon Age 2 succeeds. Whether you like the change will be up to the player. Personally, I did appreciate the faster pace, as it greatly reduced the clunkiness that I had noticed in Origins. Part of that involves much more fluid attack animations, which I appreciated, though some were occasionally a bit over the top. A particularly nice detail, mages would switch to melee animations with their staffs if enemies got too close. It did the same damage, but it was a nice detail. The game got slammed on release for supposedly dumbing down the gameplay its predecessor was so praised for, and there is some truth there. Dragon Age 2 much more strictly enforced the distinction between classes than its predecessor, and it can feel limiting. The number of specializations have been brought down to just 3 per class. That's compared to 4 per class in the base game for Dragon Age Origins, and an additional 2 per class in the Awakening expansion. Somewhat cross-class specializations, like my favorite warrior-mage archetype, don't exist in Dragon Age 2, which I thought was quite a shame. Equipment usage is now strictly restricted by class rather than just by attributes as Origins was. There was also the somewhat baffling decision to not have auto-attack on consoles. I suppose they wanted console players to feel like they had more direct control over Hawke's actions. The enemies we meet have also changed a bit. I don't mean the Darkspawn redesign, though really it's only the changes to the Hurlocks that bother me there. In Origins, the humanoid enemies operated by the same rules as the player, and humanoid enemies used the same gear. That's gone in favor of player, party, and enemies of having only somewhat overlapping abilities. Personally, I do not mind that too much, but some players felt it made the world feel less cohesive. The encounters also took a lot of flack for its wave-based design, which had new enemies spawning out of thin air in the middle of a fight. This actually hampered strategic gameplay, as it meant the player could rarely plan around enemy composition. I hate to use this word, but a lot of people found this to be lazy design. That so many of these encounters took place in the same, frequently reused environments and layouts did not help, most likely a result of the limited development time. They tried to mix it up a bit by changing which paths through the environments were open, but it was only a somewhat effective mitigation. It inevitably wears you down a bit as you enter the same cave or mansion for the 4th, 5th, and 15th time. You can still use the tactics menu to construct your companion behaviors, though as with Origins, I was usually content to use the defaults and micromanage my companions myself. While many of these things are definitely steps back in terms of versatility of character builds and approaches to combat with Origins, I want to stress that this doesn't mean the combat isn't fun. As I said, it is faster and more responsive than Origins, and so each battle itself may still be enjoyable. That is more or less how I felt, even back when the game first released. Dragon Age 2 left behind the apocalyptic save-the-world story spanning an entire country of Origins, in favor of a more grounded story about the tribulations of the Hawke family, restricted to a single city. This reduction of epic scope felt like a significant downgrade to a lot of fans, including myself. Perhaps more controversial was the choice to drop the Warden as a protagonist in favor of newcomer Hawke, the champion of Kirkwall. This particular change never bothered me in principle, because, as the devs pointed out, the Warden could die in Origins, and branching out to a new protagonist allowed them to carry less character baggage into subsequent games than, say, the Mass Effect games. The game also dropped the silent protagonist and full line selection of the first game in favor of a Mass Effect-style voiced protagonist and paraphrased dialogue wheel. This was controversial to a lot of players who outright accused BioWare of trying to turn Dragon Age into Mass Effect, and I can see the downsides. The silent, non-emotive protagonist left a lot more room for players to fill in the particulars of their character with their imagination. On the other hand, the voiced character felt like much more of a character in the interactions rather than being a step removed. They felt like a part of the scene. There was also a personality system, by which some responses were humorous, diplomatic, or aggressive. Whichever option the player used most often was used to determine what the character should say in some scripted situations, which I did not particularly like. Hawk's personalities could be so extreme that someone that wanted to mix responses depending on the situation could end up sounding unstable and inconsistent. It's a system that really only works if you were a Hawk that played to a single personality type all the time. On the whole, though, the switch to a voiced protagonist did not bother me. I was much more disappointed by being limited to a human character and a story that I felt lacked a sense of direction and hemmed in by the smaller setting and scale. I've since turned around on the question of scale. Instead of Dragon Age only focusing on apocalyptic scenarios, we're dealing with more situations rooted in the social structures and histories of the world. I make lore videos, so you can imagine how that appeals to me. Instead of trotting around the country fighting a horde of monsters to save the world, we get a much more personal story of a refugee rising in prestige in their adopted home and defending it from threats. I quite like that aspect of it now. The game doesn't really take advantage of its 3-act structure and 7-year time span as much as I would like, though. Kirkwall doesn't change very much or react to the player's actions. I would have also liked to see the player have more control over what they were doing during the 3-year time skips between acts. I tend to see these issues as more symptoms of the short development cycle. Despite these shortcomings, Dragon Age 2 does succeed in offering you the experience of playing a capable protagonist just trying to make the best of their situation, or scheming to become Viscount of the city if that's more your speed. It just lacks in the sort of out-and-out heroism or exploration of the world that Origins players had come to expect. I realized more recently that the acts of Dragon Age 2 are more phases of Hawke's life in the city rather than a continuous story conflict, which is why it felt so disjointed to me at first. Each of the first 2 acts work pretty well once you accept that the first is really just a justification to wander around doing odd jobs to raise money. It's honestly a bit refreshing to have a game integrate the side quests into the main story instead of feeling like a detour. The Witcher 3's side quests often benefited from similar framing. Act 2's story, following the ramping up of tensions between the Qunari and the elites of Kirkwall, is also pretty solid, and gives us one of the best antagonists the series has produced to date, the Arishok. Act 3, on the other hand, was a bit weak, despite being the act that's supposed to connect everything so far with the framing device. Anders' actions still inspire heated debate among fans to this day, which I expect was the point, so I call that a success. The biggest weakness I see is because Orsino and Meredith, our sort of antagonists we're meant to choose between in the Mage-Templar conflict, feel a bit underdeveloped. Meredith's hardline stance toward mages becomes less interesting once you realize she was just driven crazy by a magic rock, albeit one that was foreshadowed in Act 1. Orsino's sudden hypocritical turn to blood magic at the 11th hour comes almost entirely out of nowhere, and apparently only exists because the developers needed another boss fight, so that was disappointing. These characters are really only introduced to us at the end of Act 2, and I think it might have worked better if they had been introduced much earlier and been more entwined with Hawke's story. Instead, the build-up to the climax of the whole game is quite rushed. Setting antagonists aside, I actually find that I prefer Dragon Age 2's cast of companions to those of Origins as a whole. They're a very colorful bunch that still fall into archetypical characters sometimes, but they're written with enough charm and personality to grow beyond that. It's been pointed out to me that where Dragon Age Origins companions were people thrown together to fight a greater threat, Dragon Age 2's companions are friends that voluntarily choose to associate with Hawke for years. I think that's reflected in the writing, as they often come across more as friends than followers. The novel, if flawed, friendship and rivalry system also opened up possibilities for different types of relationships with the companions, with sometimes hilarious results. It could result in situations where a companion you've been nothing but hostile to is still utterly loyal to you because you maxed out their rivalry. It can create a dissonance in their behavior that I would have to call a flaw, but one that amuses me more than it bothers me personally. Now, the elephant in the room is Anders, whose timeline between the end of Awakening and this game doesn't really make any sense, and whose spiral into bombing religious sites from the go-lucky character he was introduced as in Awakening is a bit jarring. His possession by the spirit of justice from Awakening acts as an explanation for the latter, but he still feels like a totally new character when you meet him in Act 1. I have mixed feelings about the change because while his new obsession makes some sense, it's a bit inconsistently developed and just gets annoying.
You don't like me, Carver?
I don't like you.
That's unfortunate. Hating someone just because they're a mage is a shameful thing.
I don't hate you because you're a mage. I hate you because you won't shut up about it.
On the whole, I've warmed up to Dragon Age 2 over the years. It didn't meet what I thought a Dragon Age game should be at the time, but in time I've come to view it as expanding what a Dragon Age game can be. It did not do as well as Origins did, which I think is a bit of a shame because part of what interests me about it is the game that could come from this approach. I would love to see another take on a similar concept with more time taken to flesh it out and get it right. Give us another more street-level story, stretched out over years. Let's see a location really change over time and relationships evolve. Maybe Dragon Age 2 is a game more interesting in concept than execution, but the execution is still a fun experience. That's all I have to say about Dragon Age 2. Have a nice day.